Welcome to the China in the World podcast, a series of discussions examining China's foreign policy and shifting engagement with the world. The China in the World podcast is brought to you by Carnegie China and hosted by me, Paul Haenle. Welcome back to Carnegie China's China in the World podcast. For this episode, I'm delighted to welcome Harvard professor Bill Kirby to the podcast to discuss his new book, Empire of Ideas, Creating the Modern University from Germany to America to China, as well as other topics related to China's economy and politics. Before I dive into the interview with Bill, let me first give him an introduction. Bill Kirby is the T.M. Chang Professor of China Studies at Harvard University and the Spangler Family Professor of Business Administration at the Harvard Business School. Bill's a Harvard University Distinguished Service Professor. He serves as chairman of the Harvard China Fund, the university's academic venture fund for China, and faculty chair of the Harvard Center Shanghai, Harvard's first university-wide center located outside the United States. Bill is a historian of modern China, and his work examines contemporary issues related to Chinese business, economic, and political development in an international context. He's had a range of positions at Harvard University over the course of his career, including serving as the director of the Fairbanks Center for Chinese Studies, the dean of the Faculty of Arts and Science. As he and I were just discussing, when I was doing my master's degree at Harvard in the Regional Studies East Asia program, Bill served as the chair of the History Department and the chair of the Harvard University Asia Center. Bill, thank you very much for joining the China in the World podcast. Really looking forward to our conversation.
Thank you very much for having me, Paul.
So you just returned from a trip to China, I think in the last few days. So first of all, thank you for joining. I know jet lag can be a bear sometimes. After 3 years of COVID lockdowns in China, it seems like things are starting to open up. I'm traveling there in a couple of weeks, and I'm looking forward to seeing it with my own eyes. The flights between the U.S. and China do remain low, as I understand, as U.S. aircraft can't take their normal path over Russian airspace, and also they're quite expensive, as I understand it. But nevertheless, it seems to be opening up. You're one of the first ones back into China. I just wanted to really start out and ask you what some of the key findings, key insights that you took away during your trip, and what has changed since the last time you visited, which I think was about 3 years ago.
Well, we start with the latter part. What has changed is that it is certainly more challenging to go to China than it was 3 years ago, but much less challenging than it was 2 years ago or 1 year ago because of the end of zero COVID and the reopening of the country to international travel. But as you just suggested, that doesn't mean it's perfectly open. There are many fewer flights. And here I should blame the American carriers as well as the Chinese carriers in their negotiations about how many flights there can be. And it's a bizarre negotiation, but that can wait for another day. It's you still, when I was going, you still had to get a PCR test before going. But one of the wonderful things is that there are lots of these bureaucratic regulations, like have to have a PCR test 48 hours before you board your flight to China. And yet no one asked me for it. And
Interesting.
It's now disappeared. And so
when you land, do they take you, when you land, do you have to take one at the airport?
No, nothing. Not a thing. The only thing you have to do is to fill out on your phone a health code document saying that you are healthy and don't have COVID. And it gives various other information, but it's very normal information that is otherwise easily available. So the airports were not overwhelmed with people, but I think this will change going ahead, particularly if there are more flights that come directly in. And I found Shanghai, which was my first destination, to, of course, look exactly as it looked 3 years ago, with a little bit less street traffic, but not much less. I gave the first talk that we've had in our Harvard Center Shanghai in 3 years. And we had a very big audience for that. People were very delighted to be able to see our center reopen. And I talked to a large group of business people on another occasion, maybe 800 business people gathering also for the first time on a major business conference. And so you have a sense of a kind of a reopening internally as well as externally in China, but it's still early days.
Well, that's terrific to hear, and I know that there's many American colleagues, researchers, scholars, business folks that are anxious to get back. What in terms of the environment there, in terms of Chinese perspectives that you heard from your discussions with Chinese, what were some of the biggest changes that you saw in terms of perspectives on global matters or domestic issues related to China?
I would say that the happiest surprise was the degree to which our Chinese colleagues at different, so here I am coming from a major American university, at Chinese universities have been reaching out, trying to reestablish relations. The central purpose of my visit to China was to reestablish, in a public way, Harvard's engagement with China, something that we have had really now for nearly 2 centuries in one form or another. But to restart the partnerships, we have kept things going, of course, by Zoom, by online interaction in other forms. We have hired research assistants for our faculty and students who were not able during COVID to travel to China. All of that is fine, but being there in person is another thing. To meet with the wonderful staff of our center in Shanghai that has been 3 years without seeing a single Harvard faculty member, that was a terrific thing. They have kept, as it were, the flame of academic engagement lit during this period. And they continue to do remarkable research. So I would say, and we are now this spring sending some 25 undergraduates as interns to Chinese companies and NGOs. Maybe Carnegie would be a good place for us to send one of our interns. We're starting a Harvard summer school in Shanghai. Next summer, we're opening a new language program in Taipei this summer. So we are restarting our relations with and in China.
Well, that sounds promising and relatable because Carnegie China, as you mentioned, we had started our partnership in 2010 and we are looking forward, hopefully next month, to going back and doing exactly what you did for Harvard, reestablishing our engagement and restarting our partnership. And we've also done just that over Zoom over the last 3 years, quite intensively. And I think we can combine in both in person and Zoom, virtual kind of going forward. And Harvard students are always welcome to our Carnegie China Young Ambassadors program, which is our internship program. We've had many Harvard students over the years. They've always been terrific. Bill, one last question on your visit, and that is on perspectives on the U.S. China relationship. I'm just interested to know from your sense, how the Chinese that you interacted with, how your interlocutors there, how they talked about China-U.S. relationship, how they felt about it, and perspectives, and yours, what were your takeaways or insights in that regard?
So nothing direct from any formal academic partners, except the idea of wishing to re-engage. And so that's a sign in and of itself, because one doesn't have to do that, I should say. The same I found to be true in Hong Kong at that time. I would say that the greater change that I witnessed was less in Shanghai than in Hong Kong, where there's a sense, of course, after the national security law, of people waiting to see what will happen in the world of universities in Hong Kong and what will happen for the international partnerships that have defined Hong Kong universities as much as they have anyone else. And there, I think the jury is still out, which we shall have to see. all official voices in Hong Kong were saying, of course, one country, two systems is here forever. It's the bedrock of our policy going forward. But the more you say that, the more one worries it may not be exactly true.
Yeah.
And there's a great deal of anxiety there, actually rather more, I felt, than in mainland China. And mainland China, in a sense of rather remarkable relief that the era of COVID self-isolation, of international, being cut off from international friends, often from family, that is over. Hong Kong didn't suffer that to the same degree. So the sense of relief in Shanghai was much more palpable.
Yeah, I can imagine that. And of course, Shanghai was the city where the first real tumultuous lockdown took place in the summer of 2022.
Right. Yeah. One thing, if I may, Paul, I would say that I was always struck about the willingness of our Chinese friends in academia to connect with us over Zoom or other formats electronically during the COVID period. And just very late last year, I spoke to a major gathering at Tsinghua University on higher education, their higher education summit. And I spoke exactly as I would have spoken at home on the topic of my new book that you mentioned. And it was live streamed, I found out after the fact, to 10 million people, which is a little bit larger than my normal audience. So I was extremely impressed with Tsinghua.
That was over Zoom. It was over Zoom.
And I was extremely impressed with Tsinghua doing that.
Interesting. That's really interesting. Bill, you mentioned your book, and I mentioned your book, put out by Harvard Press last July, and Empires of Ideas, Creating the Modern University from Germany to America to China. The book looks at development of higher education in Germany and the United States, and you compare it to higher education in China using Tsinghua University, Nanjing University, and the University of Hong Kong as three examples. Can you give our listeners just a sense of the key findings and the arguments in your new book?
Sure. Universities are very old. Things that call themselves universities are a millennia and more old. But the modern research university is only 213 years old this year, founded in Berlin at what became the University of Berlin in 1810. And that model of a university that is designed to create knowledge, faculty and students working together to create knowledge, to give a high degree of academic freedom within the university, of institutional autonomy within the university, even if fully state-funded. That model has had a powerful impact all over the world, first in Europe, then in America, and then in China. And every major American university is modeled in some sense on that German model of what a research university would be. So all of the leading universities in the world as research universities, or 8 out of 10, I should say, by say 1900, would have been German universities. And the Americans then come to bat in the 20th century, late 19th and 20th century, to follow that. I don't know, Paul, have you ever been to Stanford University?
I have, yes.
Do you know what the motto of Stanford University is?
That I cannot recall.
That's because it's in German. And the motto is Die Luft der Freiheit weht, the wind of freedom blows. And this would be true, a sense of what a university should be about, that swept across the United States, made Harvard a decent university for the first time. But of course, the wind of freedom ceases to blow in Germany in the 1930s.
Right.
The universities collapse under the weight of Nazism and the war. And the point is that not all systems rise, but many often, or some often, can also fall.
Yeah.
The question for the United States today is, if the Germans led the 19th century and the Americans led the 20th century in the world of universities, can China lead the 21st century? And a key question of this book is really, how do the American and Chinese universities compare with each other today? And here, I should say that, of course, at the moment in global rankings, the Americans do very well, but the Chinese are moving up fast. And if the Americans are doing very well, still Tsinghua and Peking University outrank, in at least several of these global rankings, almost all of the Ivy League, all but two of the so-called Ivy League in the United States. So you can see the tectonic plates of global higher education shifting slowly at first, then more rapidly today. And one of the biggest reasons is that 44 out of 50 American states have disinvested in public higher education since 2008, where no place on earth is investing more in higher education across the board, but also in its elite universities, than China. And no place on earth has more of the best human capital to draw on for universities than China, both at home and in its diaspora.
Bill, one key question that comes up in all of that, where you see the Chinese universities coming forward, of course, is the question that a number of American universities that partner in China with Chinese universities have come across, and that is the issue of academic freedom and censorship and the ability to talk and debate on issues that might be sensitive in the political context in China.
Yeah.
How does that, factor into this question about where they fall out on the rankings and, how they may compare globally with other universities in the United States or Germany or elsewhere?
Great question. This is in many ways the key question, Paul. And I would say that on the one hand, the greatest weakness, the potential Achilles heel of Chinese universities is precisely that. There was a document in the year 2013 by the Central Committee of the Chinese Communist Party saying that there were 7 things that one could not talk about at a university. 7 things questions not to raise. Questions about constitutional government or civil society or the early history of the People's Republic. Questions that would lead to what Xi Jinping has called historical nihilism.
Yeah.
And I always say when I'm speaking at a Chinese university that a great university has to be a place where there is not one question that cannot be asked, let alone 7. But whenever I say that in the United States, somebody will raise their hands and say, well, that's not true at Berkeley, is it? Or that's not true at Harvard. There are at least 7 things you can't talk about in a classroom at Harvard. And they're not entirely wrong. The difference is that the censorship in China comes from above, and it's highly political, whereas in the United States today, the self-censorship of individuals comes from peer groups and from a sense of what is politically acceptable or not acceptable to say. Both have their problems, I must say. And while today the American institutions have perhaps the highest degree or among the highest degrees of academic freedom in the world, we have to remember that this was not always the case. And we have to have a certain sense of perspective. If there were free speech at every American university, you would not have had a free speech movement at Berkeley in the 1960s, because there was not free speech. And if you look to the German example, I would say, here's a question, the way I like to phrase it, is it possible to have a liberal education, that is to say, an undergraduate education in the liberal arts and sciences, in a politically illiberal polity? And the German answer for the 19th century is a qualified, yes, it is possible. Because there, too, there were certain things that were absolutely off limits in a highly conservative professoriate, and yet these were the greatest universities of their day. So I think we cannot assume that there A is an absolute standard of what academic freedom is, or B, that we have always been the best exemplars of it. It's our job to maintain ourselves or to have ourselves be the best exemplars of that so that others can follow.
Yeah. The movement in the U.S. around self-censorship in universities, I guess, the drive by some to be more politically correct, or as they call it now, the woke movement, I guess, is something to watch for. The interesting thing about that is it is still debated vigorously. I mean, people
Absolutely.
address the issue, right? They put a bright light on it and they debate it intensely, and they talk about the negative ramifications and wanting to do something about it. Of course, the issue of censorship in China and academic freedoms, those are non-debatable in the current political context. So there's a bit of a difference there, would you say, or are they more comparable than I would readily come to?
Well, I think those are quite different. Those two things are quite different. What is more comparable is, for example, the actions of several state governors and state legislatures in the United States to rewrite curricula to ensure that certain topics are not taught in American colleges and universities. These are much closer to the Chinese example of a state dictating a political orthodoxy in the classroom than the kind of wokeness, if that's the right phrase, that may limit debate at times in an American classroom. And I should say that the good news is in both the United States and in China, what students say outside of the classroom, you'd be surprised at the degree of open dialogue at Peking University and Tsinghua University, Nanjing University, and elsewhere. Just extraordinary. Within the walls of the university, the things that can be said are actually rather much more broad than one can imagine from reading the official documents about what is allegedly permissible. And the last thing I will say is, all of our universities have lived through this before. We had the McCarthy period here, right, and we've had other periods of censorship in the United States, and we may be heading in for one now. China has had it much worse. And yet these great universities of Tsinghua, Beida, and others have thrived through the Qing period, the Republican period, survived even the terrible misrule of Mao Zedong, and remain among the world's leading universities committed to open inquiry within the walls of the university.
Yeah. Well, empires of ideas, creating the modern university from Germany to America to China. Pick it up at your local bookstore, I guess online probably as well. Sounds like a fascinating examination, and thank you for sharing that. Bill, you cover and are a keen observer of issues related to Chinese business, economics, and political developments. And I would be remiss if I didn't ask you a few questions related to those issues, and in particular, some of the U.S. China dynamics. We see that Treasury Secretary Janet Yellen may travel to China here sometime soon. She gave a speech recently that sort of laid out the U.S. economic approach to the Chinese and international economy. She stressed in her speech, of course, this issue of decoupling, and she said the U.S. does not seek to decouple our economy from China's. She noted in her speech that a full separation of economies would be disastrous for both countries, which seems to make sense to me. Jake Sullivan also gave a speech recently as National Security Advisor on the administration's economic approach and how it relates to the national security of the United States. He talked about the need to invest in our own economies, in resilient and secure supply chains. Both of them, Yellen and Jake Sullivan, talked about the need for a level playing field for our workers and companies, and defending against abuses. Implied there is much of their concerns over China's economy in that regard. We just want to get a sense of your view in terms of, we when I was in the Bush administration, of course, globalization was in full swing. Economic interdependence was considered a good thing, had mutual benefits for both sides. We really shifted in just under 20 years. Talk to me, if you could, about the Biden administration's approach to China with regard to the economic and trade relationship. What's working? What's not working? What are they doing right? What needs to be improved?
Well, I should say that Secretary Yellen's recent speech is, I'll be very blunt, the most and first coherent, broad-ranging speech that I have read by a leading Biden administration official on what our policy toward China actually is. Because we've had so much rhetoric, this terrible initial summit in Anchorage, which is really a disgrace to diplomacy on both sides in the early days, and so little progress on basic and simple issues that should be easy to solve. So much low-hanging fruit in the relationship that is yet to be picked to try to at least establish a kind of a sense of mutual respect between the United States and China. And so this is, I think, a very welcome speech and a very intelligent speech. Of course, it was criticized by some in the United States and criticized by some in China, but without question, it is an olive branch toward China, and one would hope toward a resetting toward at least a professionalization of a relationship that needs to be more professional and more predictable than it has been. I think Mr. Sullivan's approach, which is, witnessed the kind of national securitization of virtually every aspect of the relationship, and not just of this relationship, is something to worry about a great deal. Where does national security stop? We have, for example, here in Boston, the oldest subway system in the United States, and it's a terrible system at the moment, the T. But we are importing and building and constructing here in Massachusetts, importing kits and constructing new subway cars from China, because no American company makes subway cars anymore. And these, when they've been put in place anywhere in China, they've been excellent cars. And yet some in Congress say we should not do it because there might be spyware on the Boston Red Line. Well, I think riders of the Boston Red Line would be delighted to have spyware if it meant that they could get to work on time. I don't think that there will be spyware on this, but certainly the Americans, who are extraordinarily good at cyber espionage themselves and at counter cyber espionage, certainly have a way of countering that if it did, in fact, somehow exist. So we have to resist the tendency to worry about everything. Why, take something very minor. Why has the Fulbright program, exchange of scholars, not been restarted by the Biden administration? Trump's administration canceled it without any reason. And all it would take is an executive order to restart it. But nobody seems to have the political courage to restart it. Somebody told me that they were afraid in the State Department that the first Fulbrighter going to China might be arrested. Well, I was a Fulbrighter in Taiwan in the late 1970s when Taiwan was under the Kuomintang dictatorship. And I was visited by the secret police many, many times. And some of my friends were deported. It's what you do as a Fulbrighter. You deal with difficult things in life, but you also engage in the world. And our fear of engagement here is something that worries me a great deal, because it is not does not come from confidence, but from really our own paranoia, and as a result of our own sense of comparative inadequacy in certain technologies. And we should be stronger and more confident than that.
Bill, let me follow up with you on that because I think, if Secretary Yellen can go, it could be a positive thing. And you obviously recall when Biden and Xi met in Bali in November, one of the things that came out of that meeting was an agreement to sustain high-level dialogue between the two sides, which I think is really important. And there was, quite a bit of that in the fall and the winter until the balloon incident, and all of that kind of got scuttled. And I agree with you as well in terms of the low-hanging fruit. I've talked often about U.S. and China need to find a problem-solving mode between the two of them.
Yes.
And try to address the smaller problems, the fixable problems, and build a foundation over time to address the bigger issues. And there's a lot, I think, that could be addressed. And you mentioned Fulbright scholars, students. There's a number of things that the two sides could do. And so this idea that Yellen's speech was really an olive branch, of course, it takes two to tango. And so, from your trip in China, one of the things we hear from the U.S. government is that that many in China have come to the conclusion that the U.S.-China relationship may be unfixable and that they've kind of moved on. They're downplaying the relationship. They're not really in a mode to use much energy or much time to address the U.S.-China relationship. And so what you hear from, the Biden administration is that they're not getting much of a response from China. With this olive branch, your trip kind of coincided with that. Do you sense that in your interactions in China that that they've come to this conclusion that it's not worth putting the time in anymore?
No, I don't sense that at all. And I would say that, of course, China's a very big place. People have different views, and you certainly have a hardening of positions at the upper echelons of the party, and perhaps foreign ministry. And yet I have a strong sense of, of course, China has 1.4 billion people. It has 95 or so million members of the Chinese Communist Party. They don't all think alike. Without question, if you were to ask your average Chinese, would you rather have good relations with the United States or with Russia? I can guarantee you that an overwhelming number of people would say that if it were possible, they would much prefer to have strong relations with the United States. And in fact, if you look over China's modern history, strong relationship between China and the United States has been, on the whole, a boon for China, not a problem, not a curse. And the Russian side is a more complicated story. So I don't get that sense, and I actually get the sense that some of the stances taken by the Chinese leadership, just as like some of the stances taken by the American leadership, may be unpopular at home. Although in China, it's much less likely that people can articulate that view. But I don't have the sense, if you know the history of U.S.-China relations, this is a long game that both of us are playing, a very long game. And it's a huge mistake to think of it in the context of the next 2 to 3 years. But these two countries are, for the foreseeable future, the two leading powers in the world. How they interact and the degree to which they can interact in a friendly and cooperative way wherever possible has enormous consequences for themselves and for the rest of the world. And here we have to worry about missed chances. Before Blinken was supposed to go to Beijing, there were, I think, 3 days in a row of very positive editorials in People's Daily about the possibility for a reset in U.S.-China relations. Clearly, People's Daily was giving a sense and a message to members of the political elite that things were about to change potentially. And then this stupid balloon comes over. The Chinese don't handle it well. The Americans don't handle it well. And Blinken cancels his visit. And I was reminded, and of course, the Chinese say it's a weather balloon, which is a remarkable thing. I was think to myself that, gee, if they really wanted to know what the weather was in Montana, why didn't they use their iPhone? But anyway, but I was reminded as a historian of 1960 when President Eisenhower and Secretary Khrushchev of the Soviet Union were to meet in Paris to try to dampen down some of the highest fires of the Cold War. And then the Americans sent a plane over Russia, which the Russians shot down. The Americans claimed it was a weather plane, but the Russians found the pilot and they had the plane. It was clearly a spy plane. And, then the Soviet Union canceled that summit. Okay, fine. 1 year later, the Berlin Wall is built. 2 years later, the Cuban Missile Crisis happens. And the world comes the closest it has ever been to nuclear war. You cannot miss these opportunities if you want to have opportunities in future.
Yeah. Well, Bill, that leads me really to my final question for you, and that is on the issue that is the most significant challenge, I would assert, in the relationship, one that has the potential to cause significant damage and potentially military conflict between our two countries. And that is the issue of Taiwan. You've been looking at this issue for decades and have spent time in Taiwan. You know the issue well. We managed, I think, to avoid the worst outcome in terms of Kevin McCarthy talking about traveling to Taiwan during this year, which is a political year in Taiwan leading up to the presidential election in January 2024. But yet the trend lines on this issue seem to be worsening. And it's hard to see how those trend lines get any better. But from your perspective, just broad question on how do we address this Taiwan issue in a way that avoids the worst outcomes? What are the key components to that in your view?
I think one of the key components would be to adhere to the arrangements that were made in 1972, reaffirmed in 1979 under President Carter, and reaffirmed under President Reagan in 1983. That is to say, adhere to our one China policy. That is to say, and adhere also to the Taiwan Relations Act. So a policy that recognizes the People's Republic as the government of all China, not taking a position on the status of Taiwan, except as both sides agree that what that status is, as was the case in the 1972 communique, and to work closely and to consult closely both with Taipei, but also with Beijing. The greatest, I'm a strong, I love Taiwan. I'm a strong believer in the need for Taiwan having the autonomous capacity to make its own decisions on where it will go in future. But the best security for Taiwan is, without question, a good relationship between Washington and Beijing. Mm-hmm. And anything that undermines that undermines Taiwan. So Mrs. Pelosi going to Taiwan for no political purpose that had anything to do with American foreign policy, but helped to undermine American foreign policy. No political purpose for herself, just a truly self-indulgent move, if I may say so, by somebody whom I otherwise admire, did not make Taiwan more secure. And every senior official that I met in Taiwan felt the same way. And that's why they made sure that Mr. McCarthy would not have that opportunity in this time, and they would meet him more quietly in California. Taiwan and the mainland have, and all of us have gotten along remarkably well through a series of diplomatic fictions. The 1972 One China policy, both sides of the Taiwan Strait agree that there is but one China, and the United States does not take issue with that, et cetera, et cetera. Or the 1992 consensus that both sides of the Taiwan Strait agree that there is but one China, but actually have different interpretations as to what this means. These have brought peace and prosperity to China, to Taiwan, to East Asia as a whole. And surely, if it's that difficult, if we can't return to those verities, then perhaps it's time for another diplomatic fiction to go ahead to allow for, we're in the longest period of peace, Paul, in East Asia since the Opium War, from 1979 to 2023, an extraordinary period of peace in East Asia, which is the precondition for its prosperity. And anything that endangers that will not just endanger, but will end that prosperity and sadly may end many lives. We have to be much more prudent as to how we deal with this issue for the sake of Taiwan. For the way we are handling this issue right now in the United States has the great prospect of making Taiwan collateral damage in a destabilized U.S. China relations. And we should allow that to happen.
Thank you for that. But let me ask you a follow-up question, and you almost anticipated it in your response. Because I agree with you. I often talk about the high-level political understandings that have existed since Nixon's visit in 1972. The U.S. ultimate aim to maintain peace and stability as an overriding kind of goal in the Taiwan Strait, being supportive of any outcome, really, as long as Taiwan is not coerced into that outcome, which means ultimately that we would have to be okay with unification. That's been our policy to date.
Yes.
And I agree with you on the need to get back to that. But what I struggle with is, given the trend lines, will that be enough going forward? China now has, in my discussions with Chinese interlocutors, one of the things I hear them say is, well, you now have a framework for engaging us under this strategic competitor framework. And in that context, we see you using Taiwan as a tool to complicate our further rise and development. Taiwan seems to be moving politically away from supporting notions of unification, and U.S. policy is shifting as well. In a sense, the U.S. and China are both changing the status quo, pointing at each other, saying that the reason they're changing is because of the other side. It's a bit of an action-reaction cycle, but the trend lines seem to be getting worse. And so I ask myself often, are getting back to those political understandings, even if that was, in the realm of possibility, is that going to be enough? You mentioned maybe we need a new set of political understandings between the two. So I guess my question is, going back to our original understandings, if we is it time to think creatively and sort of update and revise those political understandings? Is that going to be needed in the near term?
Well, I think that would be very difficult in terms of the U.S. relationship with China, because the Chinese side has been extraordinarily consistent, much more so than the Taiwan side of the American side, in what that policy is and what their policy is. The American side, I believe, ought to maintain true to its word. Why should we break our word as to what our one China policy is? Unless there's an overwhelming and reason and a compelling reason to do so, because the word of governments is supposed to actually matter in international affairs. But I think the real possibility here, and you could see this briefly during the presidency of Ma Ying-jeou, is the possibility, and of course, actually back in the presidency of Lee Teng-hui in Taiwan, under whom the 1992 consensus was negotiated. If the mainland and Taiwan can emerge with a new consensus that is acceptable to both sides, then this is the best possible outcome for the United States and for China, and above all, for Taiwan. But, our policy has been, of course, not that whatever happens in Taiwan should not be coerced, and it should be on the basis of the will of the government in Taiwan and of the people in Taiwan. But this hasn't been tested in some time. It is, and you need to have, and here I think every side is a part. The PRC has refused to talk. The DPP governments, Democratic Progressive governments in Taiwan, despite the fact that those governments would talk with Beijing. Yeah. It's a big set of missed opportunities on Beijing's front, and greater diplomatic flexibility. What's really missing here at the end of the day, well, and this is compared to the Nixon and Mao, if you will, or Nixon and Zhou Enlai, or President Carter in his remarkable diplomacy in establishing diplomatic relations, President Reagan in the third communique. What's missing here is statesmanship and leadership, and someone willing to break out of the boxes that seem to constrain all three parties. This is a triangular relationship of a sort. But at the moment, it's not a particularly happy triangle for any party. So how does one, when Xi Jinping met with Ma Ying-jeou, that was a belated effort, rather too late in his presidency, to break out of this box. Does he have that capacity again to do something quite remarkable, something like Nixon going to China? We shall see. Right now, leadership and statesmanship appears to me to be in short supply on all three sides of this triangle.
Yeah. Well, you mentioned, China's refusal to talk to Tsai Ing-wen. I was China director in the National Security Council for 2 years. The first year, Chen Shui-bian was Taiwan president.
Yep.
In the second year, Ma Ying-jeou was Taiwan president, and they were very different environments, as you might imagine. But I met Tsai Ing-wen during that time, and she's not Chen Shui-bian. She's someone you can work with. She's moderate.
Absolutely correct. Absolutely correct. It's a huge missed opportunity for PRC not to try to engage President Tsai.
And I hope, with this presidential election coming up in January 24, if a DPP candidate does manage to win, I hope the Chinese side will consider engaging, because I think it's an unfortunate mistake. But I do appreciate I agree. I think statesmanship is key here. I often talk about this is really an issue that has to be handled at the highest levels. It's very difficult, if you're a assistant secretary or below that, without the top level understandings between leaders in all three places, it's going to be very difficult to put this on better footing. But I very much appreciate your comments, Bill, and I appreciate your time and your perspectives on a range of issues. Thank you for talking to me, shortly after your trip back from China. I know it's late your time, and so we'll call it an end for this one, but hope to have you back soon in the future.
Well, thank you, Paul. Let me just end with one final thought that occurred to me as you were talking.
Yeah.
The great late British historian of diplomatic affairs, A.J.P. Taylor, had a line that I remember at times of crisis. He said, "War is never inevitable until it breaks out." And it absolutely is the job of statesmen and stateswomen to ensure that it does not.
Absolutely. As somebody from the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace.
Yes, indeed.
That was started as an attempt by Andrew Carnegie to avoid World War I. I can support that statement. We will continue.
Thank you so much, Paul. It's been a real pleasure to talk with you.
Bill, it's been great. Thank you so much. I appreciate your time, and I look forward to having you back on and maybe seeing you at Harvard or seeing you at China at some point.
My pleasure. Thank you.
Thank you for listening to the China in the World podcast. For more episodes and research, please go to carnegieendowment.org. This episode was produced by Nathaniel Schur. The music was composed by Spencer Barnett.